Hey Theo, why are you still using React? The browser supports components. Everyone should just be using web components. Well, guess what, man? There's a reason. Web components kinda suck. And if I was the only one sitting here saying that, I'd understand why you're skeptical. But if, let's say, every framework author and relevant person in the web dev space was to say they suck, maybe you would listen to them? Hopefully? Well, thankfully, I'm not alone. And a lot of these really relevant people are speaking up. A while back, Rich Harris, the creator of Svelte, made a great blog post describing all of the reasons why web components don't make sense. And if it was just him, there would be arguments against it. But it isn't. It's everyone. And now, Ryan Carniato, the creator of Solid and one of the most in-the-know people in the whole web dev world, one of the people I reference regularly when I want to make sure I'm getting things right, he's coming out against web components now. And if Ryan's against it, it's over. Before we talk about the future, we need to talk about today's sponsor.
Yo, is everything okay? Yeah, I'm just tired of changing providers for everything. We swapped databases 3 times and off platforms twice this year. How do you keep track of everything? Oh, that's easy. I just use AppWrite. AppWrite? Yeah, they kind of just handle everything for you, from data to file uploads to authentication, so you can focus on building your app. I mean, that sounds nice, but we're building a mobile chat app in Flutter. You're in luck. Not only do they have a Flutter SDK, they support real-time events straight from your data. So you're telling me I just wasted, and I'm still wasting. Are you okay, man? How do I get all of these years of my life back? Thank you to AppWrite for sponsoring this video. Check them out at appwrite.io.
So let's go through this, as well as all of the other pieces of coverage and some of the Twitter wars that have happened over Ryan once again kickstarting everyone's favorite conversation, web components, and why no one actually uses them. Real quick before we get started, though, I want to do a poll. Do you use web components? Yes, I did, but stopped. No. I think that's fine for options. Yeah, we'll just do those 3. Curious how you guys feel. Yeah, we're already seeing from these numbers, not a popular solution. But I want to talk about just how bad they are. Web components are not the future. A few years ago, I wrote an article suggesting that web components might not be the most beneficial direction for web development to head. This article was in 2020, so it's been over 4 years. It was a soft-handed look at where they made sense and where things fall apart. It wasn't geared as an us against them argument, and I hoped people would come to the reasonable conclusions for themselves. But over the past few years, I've only seen the situation worsen. Some may have never taken web components seriously, but I always have. I used them in production for 7 years. I wrote several polyfills in the early days for things like the Shadow DOM to use them before they even hit prime time. But my experience then and my experience since only points me to a single conclusion. Web components possibly pose the biggest risk to the future of the web that I can see. Fuck. So I haven't pre-read this one at all. I just saw Ryan did this article and was immediately hyped. And I've been waiting for 3 days to actually sit down and read this. Fuck. This is unusually spicy for Ryan. He's usually quite chill. I'm already getting info from chat. This is not the normal Ryan. This is pissed Ryan. This doesn't happen. This doesn't happen. I am so excited right now. Visions of Utopia. I admit that statement comes off a bit heavy-handed, but many reasons lie below the surface as to why I believe it. And it starts with understanding the proposed benefit of web components. The vision of web components is that one day, regardless of what tool you use to author them, you can have components that feel as native as DOM elements that can be added to any website without consideration of how the website is authored. No concerns about specific build tools, specific runtime mechanisms, or the way that one would ever interface with these components would ever change. In a sense, a portable, interoperable web, one that can mitigate the future needs for migration, one that sets you up for any possible future, the perfect way to future-proof your sites and applications. Compelling prospect, is it not? This is exactly why the promise of web components is so alluring and also so dangerous. Competing standards. This is one of the best XKCDs. This and the one with the single brick and the random guy maintaining it, those will stand the test of time. They get more real every day. Apparently, some context for this article, Ryan was arguing with people in the Solid.js Discord for days who were trying to convince him that web components were good, and he knows they're not, and this is him explaining why. Very fun. Good to have that context. Thank you, Dev. I didn't need to pull up the old XKCD comic for you to know the challenges with standards. The more ambitious the standard, the more likely it will have opposition or alternative approaches to accomplish it. This doesn't go away when something is standardized. It just suggests that there is one blessed way. You can take it or you can leave it. If the sheer number of JS frameworks is any indicator, we are nowhere near reaching a consensus on how one should author components on the web. We can't even decide if you should be able to put more than one in a file or not. It's hilarious. Even if we were a bit closer today, we were nowhere near that a decade ago. Yeah, I would argue we're further today, but a decade ago, no. No. React kind of invented what we consider a component, but the ways we author it is being debated every day still. The introduction of higher level primitives can have a positive effect. Suddenly, something harder to do becomes easier. This initially led to more exploration. Web components caused an increase in the number of JS frameworks in the mid-2010s. It was an important inspiration for why I created Solid.js. A similar example would be the increase in meta frameworks being built thanks to tools like Vite. Good call out that web components had an impact on the number of frameworks being made and people thinking about making their own frameworks, similar to how Vite increased the number of full stack frameworks being built, especially once it added the tools necessary to do that. I really like this comparison. The difference is that Vite, despite having a lot of weird decisions, is generally speaking a pretty good way to build full stack frameworks, whereas web components are not really a good way to build much of anything other than Intercom's little chat with us widget. But it also can have a negative effect. If too many assumptions are made, it becomes harder to explore alternative space because everything gravitates around the establishment. What is more established than a web standard that can never change? Also a fair point, if a web standard is wrong, they can't fix it later. They have to replace it later because old websites are promised to never break. If you build a website on web standards, it will continue to work indefinitely. And that's why something like Ladybird is so miserable to build, because the size of like the web standards like document is so absurd. I think it's like 100,000 pages or so now. Like the number of standards that exist in the web that have to be implemented is crazy. And that's why we end up with these weird CSS APIs, because we just have to add new ones every time the old one isn't good enough instead of fixing the old ones. We can't have a new version the same way we do with an SDK. If React wanted to change how we write components, they could make React 20 and change it. They don't, because they're honoring the promise of web not breaking, but you can't just break the web. So the established standards are the thing we want to build around. But if the standard is bad, it kind of dooms everyone trying to build around it. I've struggled with this a ton outside of web standards. JSX, according to the spec, has no established semantics, but try to convince the wide range of tools out there that they are assuming too much. This is a fun call out because JSX, which is the syntax in React that we use to write the HTML looking stuff in our JS files, that syntax is a pretty vague standard, and JSX v2 just never ended up happening or shipping. And as such, all of the JSX interpreters and things like ESBuild and Vite and all these other tools are built with the assumption that if you're writing JSX, you're writing React. But now there's other frameworks with JSX, like Solid.js. And if Solid.js uses JSX in a way that's to JSX's spec, but isn't necessarily to React's spec, it can break a lot of these tools. I know Astra ran into Dissimilar when they moved to JSX as their templating core language. It's an annoying challenge to work around. I can only imagine the nightmare it would have been if JSX had been standardized in the browser. Forgetting how frameworks like Inferno, Solid, and Million all work, having done way more optimal things with their JSX transforms, even React has changed their transformations over time. Again, the call out, like if JSX was part of the browser standard, no one would be able to change how it works, and all of the implementations of JSX have changed significantly over time. This is but one example of many. Things that help us can effectively tie our hands. We must tread carefully when standardizing any high-level mechanism because it assumes a lot. It is insufficient to say that not everyone has to use it when its existence inherently influences how we look at the platform in general. Whew. I used to help Ryan a little bit with copy and like wording stuff. I want to ask him for help now. Jesus Christ, this is good. Things that help us can effectively tie our hands. What a banger quote. It is insufficient to say not everyone has to use it when its existence influences how we look at the platform in general. Whew. I don't have a comment. He's just spitting fire, and I'm going to compliment him for it. Like, he's totally right here. Like, the web standard being bad isn't something we can just ignore. It is inherently influential. And even though we established like 5 years ago that web components suck, we still have people every day asking about supporting them better and asking about how to use them and all of these things, even though we, as a deep community, kind of know how bad they are now. Let's keep going. Opportunity cost is real. As a framework author, I understand this all too well. I often say that in this field, things are discovered as much as they are invented. So many banger, like single sentences in this. Jesus Christ, Ryan, making my job hard. Also, I can't believe I didn't call this out before. If you're interested in what Ryan has to say, his YouTube channel is super underrated because he doesn't do videos. He just does live streams. He does them every Friday, and they're awesome. And he leaves them up. And if you're looking for hours of deep dive web dev content, this is one of the few channels I try and watch. And I feel so bad that I've fallen behind on his streams. I used to watch him every week and I try my best to. Link to his channel will be in the description. Please check his channel out. He deserves so much more attention than he gets on his YouTube stuff. He's the most respected person in this whole ecosystem at this point. Hit that sub button. He deserves it. Notice that I have the bell on for him. I have the bell on for like 3 people. So yeah, if you like what he has to say here, if you like what he's doing, go give him a sub and watch his streams on Friday. They're insane. Back to the article. I often say that in this field, things are discovered as much as they're invented. What I mean by that is there's a certain truth or physics, if you will, to design decisions that when followed will lead us all to similar places. I have an example of that in my TanStack start video I just published. And that, how do I put it? I made a proposal a long time ago for an example of how I thought server functions could work with React Query to compile out like RPC functions effectively. And what I learned after that is my design for that was kind of annoying to implement at the very least, but also tRPC existed, so I went into that. And now, 4-ish years later, everyone's implementing nearly identical to the thing that I wrote. And I'm not saying that I was super ahead and invented this thing and they all copied me. I'm saying we all came to the same conclusion over time. And that happens. Like when you look at the way technology works and you're deep enough in the space, we all see the same flaws and those will often bring us to the same solutions. And it's a really important call out here. Anyways, it isn't that these tools copy each other blatantly. They fall into the grooves. Absolutely agree. And it sucks when people accuse others of copying when we're all just falling into and discovering the same things. And for the same reason, once a discovery is made that changes our outlook, the damage is done before we write a single line of code. If your job is to design a system, you don't want redundant parts. You want clear and purposeful boundaries. Instead of making a million variations on the same thing, you try to reuse one thing. More so, recognizing that to accomplish common tasks, you need multiple things. These pieces become intertwined. Very fair put. I was about to bring up React as an example. I'm curious how he does it though. For example, React developers definitely felt how long it was between the announcement of Suspense in 2017 and we finally got a data fetching story for server components in 2022. Why did this take 5 years? Because it wasn't a straight line. It took a while to understand how all the pieces fit. That in itself is reasonable. But more, React didn't want to release its piecewise until they knew they had an answer for the whole story. Also a good call out. The reason that some of these releases take so long is because React was scared of releasing things that weren't complete. We've even seen that, funny enough, with Suspense. They changed the way that multiple components under Suspense work. Watch my Suspense drama video if you're curious. We'll put way too much time into that one. Little subtle details of how these things work are enough to break whole workflows. So they go out of their way to make sure that the whole thing is fitting together before it goes public. As they looked more and more, all these pieces were related, and while they could be broken up, they needed each other to paint the whole picture. Server components do not fit everyone's idea of how data fetching with Suspense should work in React. Maybe people could have benefited from a client-side data fetching primitive. React chose to be ambitious here, which is their right as a tool, and they decided what was best. But this could have played out a number of ways. As a developer, I can always choose not to use React, and while I can choose not to use certain React features, it is clear everything in React has shifted to their current mental model. I might even be wishing I could easily migrate off React. Okay, this is interesting because it seems like the React team is going a little different direction-wise here right now. Let me find... Server actions just got renamed to server functions. Previously, server actions, as implemented in Next.js, were post functions you could fire off of forms or on clicks that could only be done sequentially. You couldn't have them in parallel. So using them for data fetching was dumb, really dumb. Changing it to server functions was scary for me because now people are going to use it to fetch data in JSX, which means on the client, after something loads, you can fetch data using them. You could before, but it was awful because of the sequential nature of them. I was terrified that renaming it to server functions would encourage that behavior even more, which I considered anti-patterns. I went as far as to getting the Next.js docs updated to remove the callout in the server action section that you could use them to render HTMX and pass data to the client because it was misleading so many people. But when I called out that I don't like this change for that reason, I got replies from the team that were really relevant. Reese called out, unless they're swapping over to making it so you can do queries from server actions instead of only using them to post, it seems like an odd change. Server functions feel like that it implies it can be used for more than just mutations. This is definitely happening. And then Jimmy, who is the one in charge of the Next.js team, called out that there will be explicit new APIs. And Ricky came in here to say, when I said that using server actions for fetching JSX was misuse, is that a misuse? Clearly implying that the intent here is to enable the new primitives in React to be used for things on the client side to get data from the server. So while, yes, the direction React was pushing and the mental model they were fighting for was very much server first, and server rendering is the method of updating content on the page, it does seem like they're caving a little bit and going a little more into allowing for client data fetching primitives. So to the point here that you can always choose to not use certain React features, it's clear they've shifted their mental model. I would argue, due to the pushback, React is willing to adjust their mental model to encompass more of the community. And they're willing to take steps back and make changes based on what does and doesn't resonate with the community. And the fact that people were wishing they can migrate off React is part of why they're doing that. That all said, like, the thing I'm talking about happened after this article, and I bet he would have written this paragraph differently if the order of events was different. Anyways, there's a big difference here. React is a library and it isn't a standard. Those options aren't the same when it comes to standards. If all I wanted was scope styles and now I have to deal with the shadow DOM because that was the abstraction that best fit with having a single way to do things due to web components, well, that's what I'm stuck with. When primitives overstep their desired usage, when they over-abstract, you don't get to come back from that. You've already paid the cost. And as anyone who has done major architectural refactoring of a problem can attest, the hardest part is adjusting boundaries. If things fall under the same logical grouping, they are easier to update. It is when you need to break things apart that it gets truly challenging. You can always add another layer of abstraction to solve a problem, but removing one can be difficult. Well, where are all of these bangers coming from? Jesus Christ. Yeah, you can always wrap more bullshit around a problem, but you can't always remove layers to solve the problem. So somebody called out this article feels like it's falling in the comparing web components to React pitfall. I don't agree right now at all. Like the only thing that he's called out so far about web components specifically is that if you're trying to use scoped styles, bringing in shadow DOM because it's the only way to use scope styles because web components sucks. Everything else is just the framing of why standards are important. He's not comparing anything to React so far, at least. Just the type of problem, not the goal of the solution. But yeah, we'll see if that changes as we go forward. It is worth noting that a big portion of why web components exist is because of people on the Chrome team at the time's disdain for React, specifically a certain Alex Russell, who was not fond of React. Their goal was to make it irrelevant. They've since changed their goal, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But web components were built as a standard as a response to React, not as a replacement for React, not as a similar mental model to React, but as a response to it, absolutely. The cost of abstraction. So the fundamental problem with web components is that they're built on custom elements. Elements are not components. More specifically, elements are a subset of components. One could argue that every element could be a component, but not all components are elements. So what? It means that every interface needs to go through the DOM, some in well-defined ways that aren't a perfect fit, and some in newly defined ways that augment or change how one would deal with elements to accommodate extended functionality. I'm curious where he goes here. I have a lot of thoughts, but thus far he has covered everything I've wanted to say. No, I have to. I can't not. I'm thinking too much about it. So to iterate on what is being said here, an important thing to understand about elements versus components is that an element is meant to be a dumb piece like a div or a button or a paragraph. Web components are cool because they let you write your own custom-based elements like this. And you can even do things like pass them HTML because that's how elements work. But the idea of an element inherently containing its own things, like if I wanted to have this labeled button with edit, and I wanted this to be its own thing that I could reuse in 3 places, that is no longer just an element because it doesn't have the same primitives. An HTML element is the base primitive. It doesn't have sub-elements unless you declare them. A component not only has sub-elements, potentially, it has the ability to pass elements in different types. You can have, like, in React, I could have a prop here, some component react.element, react.element. So now I can pass this app component, some component, and render it. Let's do that. Props.some component. And now if I go to the main and pass here some component equals div sup nerds, that just works. And this idea of properties that you can pass, state that you can own like this, all of these ideas are an important part of components. Elements don't inherently have state beyond like form data that is baked into them to be the minimal primitive that is part of the browser. And even then, the expectation is that you're controlling that with JavaScript. The idea of intertwining state, behaviors, styles, and markup as one box, that concept is a component. I didn't even really dive into styles here, but the idea that you could write style code in this that only affects this component and doesn't affect others is also important. And I've been using React long enough to remember times before we were deep on things like Tailwind, where you would put class names here, still have a CSS file, and things would break all the time because you accidentally used the same class name in two places. All of these things were just part of the experience. And as we have gotten better at encapsulating our components so they live in isolated boxes, building large applications with lots of developers has gotten significantly easier. Components won for a reason. This model lets you write things that are simple, simply, and write things that are complex, maintainably. And that is something unique to components. And part of why components work is because the primitives that they use are either other components or elements. And having those as the base properties that we are assembling components with is a huge part of why they are so powerful. Web components, by design, are trying to blur the line between an element and a component, and it's a mess. It's back to the article. So what? It means that every interface needs to go through the DOM, some in well-defined ways that aren't a perfect fit, and some in newly defined ways that augment or change how one would deal with elements to accommodate for the extended functionality. To begin, DOM elements have attributes and properties. This is so that they can be represented as HTML. Attributes accept only strings, while properties, being a JS interface, can handle any value. Really good call out. When you're passing things in traditional HTML, you could only pass strings. But when you're using JavaScript and something like JSX or any other web framework with components in it, you can pass things like markup. You can pass another component. I could make a quick counter button and pass it here, and it will just work. That's so cool. And web components do not let you do these things. They make that type of composability basically impossible because they expect everything to be a fucking string. Native DOM elements have many rules around specific attributes and properties, like how some are Booleans, existence means that they apply, while others are pseudo-Boolean, like they need an explicit true or false. Whew, yeah, again with web standards things, when they change them, it's too late. Some properties reflect to attributes and others don't. A goal of templating languages is to solve this in a uniform way. We can make special rules around known elements and attributes, but with custom elements, we don't know. So this is why some templating libraries have interesting prefixes to indicate how things should be set. Even Solid's JSX has things like attribute : prop : and bool : prefixes for this reason. Now every runtime location and compiler hook needs to be aware of it. Great, yeah. So because to clarify what is being said here, because this is a really important point that just took a second for it to click for me even, native DOM elements have a lot of weird ways to interface with them. Like some things are just, you pass it like hidden, like, or if I have a button, let's say I have a button in here. We'll go back to the app here. If I want this button disabled, I can just write disabled. But if I want area disabled, if I recall area disabled, you have to explicitly pass it true. So even though those are both disabled flags, one you can just pass without giving it a value. The other one needs to be passed a string value of true or false. And that's just how HTML works. And this would be terrible. Okay, this is terrible, but we get around it because every framework, every tool built around the web has the standards document saying what each of these elements do. This is annoying, but we've been able as a community to work around it because it's a standard that we've all agreed on. And even though the standard means these different elements have different behaviors, we can build around it in a standard way. But if we're making our own elements as being described here, we don't know which of the ways these attributes work. We don't know if it's blindly treated as a Boolean if we just pass it the flag. We don't know if it's an attribute. We don't know if it's a property. So in order for this to work, especially if you're trying to mount a web component on another framework like React or Solid, you now have to manually declare all of these things for every single element type. That sucks. Somebody asked in chat, did I just say semantic HTML is annoying? No. Semantic HTML, meaning these two things are different and you pass them true differently. That's not semantic HTML. That is bad design that it's too late to fix. There's a difference here. And the difference is when you're adding new elements willy-nilly using things like web components, you are going to have problems. And Solid has had to solve these with weird prefixes. And that sucks. Sorry, I keep saying attribute when it's supposed to be attribute. I don't know if it's my accent or something, but I've gotten enough annoying comments about it that I'm just going to rotate between the two because it's funny now. You might be thinking we need better templating as a standard, but like JSX above, you need to consider the implications of that decision. A few years ago, most people would have probably agreed that the way something like lit-HTML did template rendering was a good approach. Other solutions could output it. However, in the interim, we realized that reactive rendering, like what Solid does, outperforms it. It does so by changing the semantics of the templating. If we had moved ahead with the way Lit was doing things, we'd have a standard that isn't the best way to do templating. Also a fair point, like the early proposals and the way things like Lit were working might have seemed really good at the time, but we learned a ton since. And now we're in the middle of the signals wave because of Solid.js proving how powerful and performant they can be. It doesn't end there. DOM elements can be cloned, but custom elements have different behaviors, which means they should be imported instead. They have DOM-based lifecycles that can trigger synchronously or asynchronously, depending on when they upgrade. This wreaks havoc on things like reactivity tracking and context APIs. Oh man, the weird DOM lifecycles that these elements have is obnoxious. I've seen a couple examples. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but when I saw them, I was like, wait, what? Yeah, if you have a web component that has its own lifecycle that has been mounted by Solid that has a lifecycle, now you have to build a bridge between these two different ways of managing components and lifecycles. That is hell. However, these details are important to interface with native DOM behaviors and events. These are also all things that a JavaScript component doesn't have to worry about. There are other idiosyncrasies, like the way event targets work in the shadow DOM. Some events don't compose, like they don't bubble beyond the shadow DOM boundaries. Some events don't bubble consistently because they don't recognize a different target, like in focus in, because the shadow host is always made the target no matter which child element gains focus. Oh man, that sucks actually. I had no idea. So quick, making this one a little easier to understand. The focus elements on a web component don't go to the child element that gained focus. They go to the whole element itself, which is obnoxious. Whew. Especially if you're trying to put shadow, or if you're trying to put web components in web components, which you basically can't do. Yeah, we could talk about these for days, but I don't want to divert too much attention here. Some things are today's shortcomings and some are by design, but the commonality here is that they all require specific consideration that otherwise wouldn't be necessary. And of course, this has performance overhead. And of course, Ryan has a blog post. If it's about performance in the web, especially around components, Ryan has covered it meaningfully. Yeah, people are correcting me there. If the event is viewed from a handler inside of the shadow DOM, the target is correct. But if it's viewed from a handler outside, it's opaque to which element in the shadow DOM was targeted. It's obnoxious, but there are workarounds. Okay, that makes more sense. So if I am watching for the focus events externally, it will only tell me that it targeted the web component. It won't tell me what inside of it was targeted. Inside of it, you have the actual event, but now you're getting a different event with different data inside of the web component and outside of the web component, which is, what? How are we just okay with that? That almost feels worse. But even if you consider the performance cost minimal, where does it leave us when going to the server for things like SSR? Yes, you can completely do SSR with web components. Hydration is completely achievable. To be clear, this was not the case before. Web components did not server-side render previously, and there's a lot of hacks people have made to make it possible to do this. But they're a DOM interface in a place with no DOM. Also a good call out, the browser has a DOM, which is how server components were built to work, with the real DOM and the shadow DOM and the relationship between them. You don't have a DOM on the server. The way most server-rendered frameworks work is they spit out a string that then gets rendered in the browser and then hydrated on the JavaScript on the other side. You can make a minimal wrapper to handle most things, but this is all extra overhead. All because we tried to make components something that they aren't. On the server, there is no such standard. We are back to having specific solutions. It is just another type of framework with no more guarantees than if I choose Vue or React for my next project. There's nothing wrong with that, but we need to recognize that fact. That's a fair point. If you're doing this on the server, if the goal of web components is to be the standard, so you have to make decisions around these things. To use web components, you have to use some form of framework around them, especially if you're also server rendering. It sucks. The real cost of web components. I just saw a message from Ryan saying that he's on vacation and went on vacation right after posting this and wanted to apologize for not being part of the discourse after making the blog post. So thank you, Ryan. No hard feelings. You're not missing out on much. Everybody's just lamenting how right you are. So yeah, if you're wondering why Ryan's not in chat and why he hasn't said anything after this, he's on vacation. Let him have a good vacation. He deserves it. He deserves a break right now. The complete picture is one where the complexity of dealing with native elements increases to account for the newfound flexibility of web components. It is something that as tools support them better, not only is the user of them paying the price, but all of the users of the tool are. More code to ship and more code to execute to check these edge cases. It's a hidden tax that impacts everyone. This is another good call out because I think a lot of the people who like web components aren't framework authors. They're using them for very small cases for medium-sized applications. Every framework author understands how bad this is, like all of them. I think every framework author, except the React team, went through this phase. I certainly did. Some of Svelte worst design flaws are the direct result of us planning for a world in which web components were the dominant compile target. I believe Evan did. Ryan in particular went very deep on them. Because of course we would. We're all super competitive with each other, so if we could offload the work to a platform primitive that results in better perf and smaller bundles, then we're going to be all over it. In a sane world, the fact that we of all people are the least enthusiastic about them would prompt some deep introspection from the people designing these specs. Instead, we get admonished for not contributing to Handwave making them better. Or we get subtweeted about conflicts of interest and other inane bullshit. You see, it's a conflict of interest to maintain a framework even though web components don't compete with frameworks. But there's no conflict of interest involved in being paid to work on web component frameworks or specs or component libraries. Meanwhile, we're always 20 specs away from parity with userland, and the complexity of the very platform keeps compounding. It's absolute fucking madness. Oh, and he said other than React here, Ricky came in. React also went through this phase. The conclusion everyone else came to was pretty quick, so it might look like it was skipped from the outside. Oh, also, Sam called out that Ember tried and gave up because of this. And yeah, that's the context, is every framework author tried because we all wanted to support the browsers. This is a great one. They don't know how awesome web components are. Lol, we spent years trying. They don't work, they suck. There were people from the Angular team commenting on this too. Evan Yu had a rant about it. Everyone's been calling this out. I want to shout out one of my favorite people in this ecosystem, Nicole Sullivan. Nicole was one of the leads on the Google Chrome team. When she joined, she saw how much tension there was between the Chrome team and framework authors. So she went out of her way to try and bridge this gap and better understand. The first thing she did was find a ton of data. She went and scoured the web to see what websites were using what technologies. Nicole had an awesome fireside chat at Reactathon last year that I've been thinking about since I heard it. So I want to take this opportunity to share parts of it. Link in the description if you want the whole thing. Whole thing is worth it. Okay, so the context here is Nicole was asked about what benefits they've seen since they started collaborating with the React team and other framework teams more. And her answer here, I think, is really valuable for understanding how we got to the place we're in today.
I don't think it's hard to even put into words how much it changed things. When I joined Chrome, there was sort of a sense of an adversarial relationship with frameworks. I don't know if folks remember that, but there was just this, I just didn't understand why. It seemed really silly to me, like we should be on the same team. Clearly we have the same goals.
It's on the web, yeah.
But it was this adversarial relationship. And I think now a huge part of our strategy as an entire organization is that we're focused on how do we meet the needs of abstractions and tools, and frameworks fall into that bucket. We did a little study where we looked at like who were the developers that were using vanilla JavaScript. And what we found is they were most likely to work on their own, just themselves or maybe one other person. They were most likely to not use any other tools, to not use NPM, to not use like the standard set of tools we've all gotten used to. And so the conclusion I drew from that was these are hobbyists, or maybe students, but probably hobbyists. And so that allowed us to switch things around and say, no, the bulk of the web uses frameworks, cares about frameworks, want their frameworks to be good and fast and everything else. So that really switched us to thinking about how do we make framework authors happy and framework developers have great outcomes. Yeah.
Wonderful.
And then the React team, I should just say, was amazing. Like, they worked with us when we still had no idea what we were doing. They spent a ton of time with us being like, nope, that's not how hydration works.
Yeah.
So that we could learn and start to, both put stuff in the browser that was useful, but also contribute performance-wise to these
Absolutely.
tools.
I won't.
Do you guys understand how big of a deal this is? I think about this quote at least once a week, and I was there when it happened a year ago. The browser teams, Chrome, as Nicole, who was on the team at the time, said, and was on the team at the time when she was talking here, she was speaking here as a representative of the Chrome team, specifically called out that at the time she joined, it felt like there was an adversarial relationship between Chrome and framework authors, but real developers used frameworks. The people who were building with vanilla browser standard stuff were hobbyists. And in order for the web to keep improving, in order for the great experiences we expect to use online to get better, they had to help the framework teams. And at the time, they didn't even understand hydration, but the React team was patient enough to work with Chrome and help them figure these things out. And that's why we're seeing the developments we're seeing today. The important point, and the reason I'm calling this out now, is web components were created in the peak of that anti-framework era, where the Chrome team both didn't understand frameworks and didn't like them, and saw a conflict between the two. And when you look at how frameworks work, and you look at how web components work, it makes perfect sense why it is this way because of that disdain between the two. And this is, to be frank, it's probably why Nicole is now at Apple. Her ability to get through this political bullshit to do the right thing is unreal. And the conversations I had with her were some of my favorites. I wanted to bring her on. And by the way, Nicole, still open invite if Apple will let you. I just don't want to get you in trouble with your job. She's just one of those people that has done more for the web than almost any other group. And she's worked so hard to undo the damage of that old culture. And I wanted to call that out because I think it's really important. And honestly, I highly recommend watching this whole thing. It is full of bangers like that. Link will be in the description. Thank you, Nicole, for the hard work you've done. Thank you for recognizing that we use frameworks for a reason. And thank you for starting to undo the damage of web components. Wanted to go on that rant quick because there's a reason all the framework authors have this problem, and it's not because of skill issues. It's because of that weird tension between the two. All the comments from chat here. Brutal quote, I can imagine Hacker News losing their shit. This is mind-blowing. They really believed everyone wants to use vanilla JS and HTML? Yep. Yeah, someone should just write a blog post based on that talk and post that on HN, because HN video posts don't do well on HN. Anyways, back to the article. And by the way, for those who have stuck around this long, I know this is a long video. We have to get to Leah's response because I'm sure this will be really good. I have massive respect for Leah. She's changed my opinion on things many a time, so I'm very excited to read that after. So make sure you stick through to the end so we can get to that too. Anyways, I've talked about where early standardization would have been catastrophic, but it also has the potential to stifle future innovation along certain paths because it assumes too much. Improvements to hydration, things like resumability, partial or selective hydration, depend on event delegation to work. But if the Shadow DOM messes with that, then how could web components fit the model? SSR, some might say, was an oversight because we didn't think about that much in 2013, but the gap only continues to grow over time. One of the things that most modern frameworks do is they'll let you generate the HTML on the server so you can load that before the JavaScript has started. The JavaScript starting and taking over the page, that's what hydration is. You get the HTML first, and then the JS comes in, and the button might have rendered on the server, so you have a button. When you click it, it doesn't do anything. The JavaScript comes in, re-renders the button in order to attach to it, and now when you click it, it works. Most frameworks are smart enough to have a little bit of JavaScript running that is keeping track of anything that gets clicked while all of the other JavaScript is showing up. So it can make a queue of these events that occurred before the JS loaded, and then it can replay them once the hydration happens. But as mentioned before, with the weird targeting of Shadow DOM elements, you can't watch and replay events that occur inside of a web component. So if I have a web component that's like a counter button, and I click it, and I get the events that the shadow component was clicked, I can't hydrate those into the web component after the fact to actually trigger those events because the web component is isolated at a really weird spot. So even if you server render it, it breaks all of these types of behaviors that it, to be fair, took framework authors years to figure out. But since web components were built as a reaction to frameworks instead of in collaboration with frameworks, they missed all of these learnings, and now we're reinventing all of them, and all of the complexity, all of the weird decision-making, all of the work around building with frameworks has to be done around web components to make them work. So you're not just picking web components or a framework, you're picking web components and a weird framework built around their madness, or a framework that already has their madness figured out. Anyways, for those curious, I just did a video on scheduler.yield. That's an example of one of the APIs that was designed in collaboration with the React team to make it so all frameworks can do more. I have this one tweet I wanted to highlight because I thought it was really funny and I originally put in the video. I had to Google what web components were, and I first looked at the source code. I know I'd entered the 9th level of hell and quickly closed the tab. I've seen those demons before. No, sir. Hell nah. I don't even want to put you guys through looking at that syntax, so I'm not going to put it in the video. But if you want to see why people are so upset, go look up some example server components. Back to the article. As I said, like, React and other frameworks figured out how to solve all these SSR problems, web components had no concept of SSR because they're a browser standard, and the browser doesn't care about the server beyond what it sends to the browser. So the idea of a web component being a standard that can run on the server too became the community's problem to solve, which sucks. You have to deal with compilers and build tools anyways. We're moving away from this idea of them being a better standard, and they're nothing more than a developer experience consideration at that point. Something you have at authoring time that vanishes from the final output. For optimal user experience, we optimize away the components. Another banger from Ryan, components are pure overhead. This blog post was nuts. The idea proposes is that components are a developer tool that do nothing but make your application slower once they're compiled down, and ideally you could compile them out entirely. But web components are making them standard, so the inefficiencies of components and the overhead that they imply is now part of the browser. I'm not saying someone couldn't find some interesting solutions to these problems, but they all imply taking on the hidden cost due to the foundational misalignment of having the wrong abstraction. This is what makes the dialogue here so difficult. It isn't something that you improve. It's just a mistake for a number of things. Now we can all say different solutions have different trade-offs, and maybe something like web components could only possibly succeed with support of things like standards bodies because of how pervasive it would need to be to work. It's an ideal that we're working towards and just aren't quite there yet. But is it actually ideal? Utopia Revisited. Is this going to be his alternative proposal? Ooh boy. We often hit a similar debate when talking about micro frontends or microservices. It is beneficial for organizational purposes to align projects with your developers. It follows Conway's Law. For those who don't know, Conway's Law describes the link between communication structures of organizations and the systems that they design. It's named after the computer programmer Conway yada yada. It's organizations which design systems, in the broad sense used here, are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of those organizations. This is you ship your org chart. However your teams talk and are structured, the way your software comes out will be structured similarly. The isolation or portability afforded by web components means that one could have multiple different components on the page from different sources. Now, like the other, prudence is in order. Similar to not wanting to write all of your microservices in different languages, you might not want to author all of your components in different frameworks. But frontend is a much more restrictive space. The cost of each kilobyte of JS is not insignificant. It isn't only maintenance, why you wouldn't want to mix and match, but to reduce payloads. And this is where the wheels start coming off. Really good point. With web components, the isolation makes reusability between the parts much less. So even if a web component could theoretically be a few kilobytes less than the React alternative, if you have 15 components in React and 15 web components, the web component side starts to weigh more. If we're talking about bringing, and this is the one place I'll side with web components. If we have a super minimal HTML page, like let's say a blog, and we want to have one element on it that's dynamic, we want to reuse it in multiple places, we shouldn't have to introduce React to our code base to do that. And web components are a compelling way to have single reusable pieces of interactivity on an otherwise static application. And if this is like, I have a blog, I want a comment section, or I want a like button, and my options are web components or React, web components probably look pretty good to you. But if you're building an interactive application, and your choice is between a bunch of web components where you can't compose them or mount them inside of each other or hydrate them after the fact or process the elements before the JS loads and all of these things, or React, where all of these problems are solved for you, React is actually the better solution, not just the preferred solution, but technically speaking, React will run better. It will work better. The maintenance of the project will be significantly better. The size of the JS bundle will be smaller. All of these things are optimized in React because when one framework is running your web page and your application, reusability becomes much easier. And the reusability and composability of web components as their individual boxed piece doesn't scale across your application. It's just the most reusable part. You can't interop with that part, you can't compose that part, but you can use that part well. With React, you have all of this flexibility and the way smaller payload size because you're only loading React once. If your goal is to future-proof, then you need to be prepared to keep different versions of even the same library on the same page. This is no different for Lit as it is for React. You could choose to never update anything, but that is an option without web components too. There are no additional guarantees here. To future-proof, the only choice is to freeze things, maintain multiple versions, and load more JS on your page. Yep. Realistically, you will update your libraries in lockstep, which is also the same with any library. In those cases, if you only have a single library on your page, web components aren't doing anything for you but adding more overhead, possibly getting in the way of features that the library provides now and in the future. You might as well use the library without web components. Fair point. It's funny, he just counteracted my example with the blog immediately. The second consideration is granularity. If you have a micro frontend, then that is a contained swappable piece. If in the future you decide it's not the best way to handle things, then you can swap it out. But once you adopt web components everywhere, you'll need to address each of these touch points. Web components differ from micro frontends and microservices because they can be used cross-sectionally. This is good for standardization, but I've never seen a company that uses jQuery ever completely be able to get rid of it. Also a fair point. If you have one component that uses one library or tool, and you have this web component or this micro frontend in your application, you'll never fully get rid of it. I know that if I recall the old Rails Ember code base at Twitch that I helped move us off of in 2018 still has some pages being served, which is insane. The most compelling uses for web components are as a sort of micro frontend container. In that case, you don't pay the scaling costs, the outside communication is minimal, and they're easy to swap in and out. The great example here, if we've ever been to a website that has the little like chat widget in the bottom, like the intercom, if you're not familiar, intercom is the chat app everyone has on their site, the little chat button where you can talk to them directly here. That is a great example of a web component because now every developer in every framework can mount this annoying little chat thing on their site trivially. You don't have to adjust it to a given framework. And it doesn't communicate in and out as much. Like my page doesn't care what's going on in intercom. So it works well for that. Outside of that, there are not very many use cases that make sense. As mentioned, it's a one-off scenario. In those cases, though, the friction is low enough that having web components isn't necessary. I'd take them for the ergonomics to put a Zendesk widget. Did he really call that out, Zendesk widget? It's basically the same thing as the intercom one. That is hilarious. That is... We're on the same page a little too much. Like the fact that that's the only good example says so much. Like web components inadvertently built the perfect standard for annoying chat widgets and nothing else. This conclusion is not the end of this. I'm going to read the Leah thing, but I want to hear what he has to say at the end first. That is what it comes down to. I couldn't argue that there aren't ergonomic benefits to using web components in some scenarios, but the cost that it imposes everywhere is steep. While I shouldn't be quick to disavow technology for the types of poor patterns it enables one to do, it is difficult to stand behind it when it never fits in the ideal scenario. At best, it is nominal overhead. That's the important point. It's not just that it can be used wrong, it's that it never quite fits right, even if you're using it correctly. That's the problem. Web components are a compromise through and through. As we know, sometimes we need compromises, but that is nothing to get excited about. And some compromises are better than others. It was presented to me that in 10 years from now, it's possible that no one would be using Solid, but a web component would still be there with the same interface as today. But I thought for a moment and responded that I'd still build it with Solid because that would be the best choice for today. In 10 years, even if I had to use a 10-year-old version of Solid, it would still be better than the web component version. 10 years doesn't erase that. Hopefully in 10 years, I'd be using something better. I really like that point. I'm increasingly tired of the the things you're using today are going to die. You need to use standards because those will be there forever. Thanks to the standards being there forever, an old Solid.js codebase will still work in 10 years. It might not be fun to work in and documentation might be old, but the documentation for web components will be old and still bad, and using them will be old and still bad. I work in React codebases from 8+ years ago sometimes, and they're fine. They're not great, they're not pleasant, but that's not because they got worse over time. That's because I got used to better things. And the only reason standards in the web are better than frameworks in the web for longevity is because they don't improve. As Adam said, I have 5-year-old web components that still work. My guy, I have 8-year-old React class components in production that still work. What are you talking about? The difference is that most React devs don't want to work on old class components. Web components haven't degraded the same way because nobody ever wanted to use them. The fact that the developer experience in React and other frameworks improves every year is not a victory for web components because they are worse than React was 8 years ago. They're going to be worse than using React today in 8 years too. It's a stupid argument, and I'm happy that Ryan called it out too because I've hated that argument for so long. The decision is completely orthogonal. So in a sense, there are nothing wrong with web components as long as they are only able to be what they are. It's the promise that they are something that they aren't, which is so dangerous. The way their existence warps everything around them that puts the whole web at risk. It's a price that everyone has to pay. Banger. Follow Ryan, check out his YouTube. Let's hear Leah's response. Web components are not framework components, and that's okay. Disclaimer, this post expresses my opinions, which do not necessarily reflect consensus by the whole web component community. A blog post by Ryan Carniato, titled Web Components Are Not the Future, has recently stirred a lot of controversy. A few other JS framework authors pitched in, expressing frustrations and disillusionment around web components. Some web component folks wrote rebuttals, while others repeatedly tried to get to the bottom of the issues so they could be addressed in the future. I want to see the frustrations. It's probably, this is the Evan Yu thing I talked about earlier. If web components truly simplify frameworks while retaining the same level of features, I'd be the first one to rewrite Vue on top of it. I'm sure Ryan and Rich hold the stance too. The conclusion is collectively no, it's a tax and we should get over it. And then Rich, as I said before, the insinuation that there's some kind of vested interest in suppressing web components is both illogical and ironic, given the author's day job. Really distasteful, and it totally misreads Ryan's argument. Yeah. When everybody I've heard of says this sucks, and a bunch of people I've never seen before say, wait, no, you're wrong, I trust the people I've heard of. I'm sorry, I just do. I know it's a bias, but all of the authors of all of the most popular tools on the web have made a pretty clear stance here. Anyways, when you're on the receiving end of such an onslaught, the initial reaction is to feel threatened and become defensive. However, these kind of posts can often end up shaking things up and pushing a technology forward in the end. I have some personal experience after I published my 2020 post, The Failed Promise of Web Components, which also made the rounds at the time. I was approached by a bunch of folks about teaming up to fix the issues that I described. The results of these brainstorm sessions was the Web Components CG, which I'm assuming is the something group, community group. Group is for collaboration between people working on web component libraries, tools, documentation, and standards. This was a group formed to try and make web components usable. And now, as a life of its own, it's become a vibrant web component community that has helped move several specs of strategic importance forward. As someone who deeply cares about web components, my initial response was also to push back. I was reminded of how many times I'd seen this pattern before. It is common for new web platform features to face pushback and resistance for many years. I saw that the example she gave on Twitter was apparently people hated CSS for the first 10 years and then came around to it. There were not established solutions that CSS was trying to poorly recreate. The established solution was tables, and tables were much less flexible and much less capable than CSS. Web components are the less flexible and capable solution here. If the more flexible thing is already dominant, it will stay winning. And that's what I didn't like about her argument is CSS didn't win because it was the standard or because it was pushed right. It won because it was better, and it was better because it was more flexible. And apparently it wasn't originally. It was way more limited. Naman, who is an absolute fucking CSS and styling wizard, he's the guy who made StyleX, if you're not familiar, and is the only person to talk shit on Tailwind in a way that I can actually learn from. People hated how limited CSS was. They didn't hate the idea itself. And when CSS became less limited, it became more popular. Web components are the limited option here, and the frameworks are the less limited option. There are deficient APIs which can be fixed by adding more stuff. Also, a fair point, CSS needed more things to be better. Web components don't need more things. They need to be rethought. As Leah says here, we tend to compare new features and new platform stuff to the current userland practices, and their ergonomics often fare poorly at the start, especially when there's no immediately apparent 80-20 solution. Making things possible tends to precede making them easy. That is a fair point. Like, the first priority of the standards committees is to make things that can work at all and then make them easier and better. But once the standard is there, it's there and it can't be undone. So I think if you want to do that type of experimentation, frameworks are the right place, not the web platform. As she says here, web platform features operate under a whole different set of requirements and constraints. They need to last decades, not just until a major release. They need to not only cater to the current version of the web platform, but anticipate its future evolutions and be compatible with them. They need backwards compatibility with the web, as it was 20 years ago. They need to be compatible with a slew of accessibility and internationalization needs that the userland libraries often ignore at first. That's not fair. Userland libraries have not been ignoring these things for a while, and there's plenty of standards, like Canvas, that are not particularly accessible. It's, yeah. And a good point from Naman here, Web Component API breaks a whole bunch of expectations of how HTML and the DOM work, not a browser standard. Yeah. It's weird. Yeah, canvases are breaking a lot of the same rules here. And kind of we start on WebGPU. It's really cool, but it's chaos. That all said, most modern frameworks put a lot of work into things like accessibility. And just because tools 15 years ago didn't, doesn't mean that this is a fair statement. In fact, tools like React yell at you when you're not making things accessible. Tools like SvelteKit do the same. I just don't agree with this point anymore. Last point she has here, though. They're developed in a distributed way by people across many different organizations with different needs and priorities. So they're designed by committee, which is not necessarily a good thing. Usually, the result is more robust, but it takes a lot longer. That's why I've often said that web standards are product work on hard mode. They include most components of regular product work, like collecting user needs, designing ergonomic solutions, balancing impact over effort, and leading without authority. But with the added constraints of a distributed, long-term, and compatibility-focused development process that would make most PMs pull their hair out in frustration and run screaming. Totally agree here. Making web standards is hard as balls. I would argue this means you should be pickier about which things you bother going the web standard path with. And I don't think web components were a thing worth standardizing until way more of this work was done, if at all. They have not played out in a way that I see them as beneficial. Here's the CSS thing I mentioned before. I'm old enough to remember this pattern playing out with CSS itself. Huge pushback when it was introduced in the 90s. It was clunky for layouts and it had terrible browser support. Why fix something that wasn't broken, folks cried. Embarrassingly, I was one of the last holdouts. I like CSS for styling, but I was among the last to switch to floats for layouts. Tables were just so much more ergonomic. The majority resistance lasted until the mid-2000s, where it went from this will never work to clearly this was the solution all along, almost overnight. And the rest, as they say, is history. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized, as often happens in these kinds of heated debates, the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Having used both several frameworks and several web components, and having authored both web components and even one framework over the course of my PhD, both sides do have valid points. Frankly, if framework authors were sold the idea that web components would be a compile target for their frameworks, and they'd gotten today's web component APIs, I understand their frustration. Worse yet, if every time they tried to explain that this sucks as a compile target, they were told, no, you just don't get it, or worse, that they should just work harder, or they're biased because they're framework authors, you'd feel gaslit too. Yeah, damn right. Web components are still far from being a good compile target for not all frameworks, for any framework not explicitly built around them. That's the one change I'd make here. But that's not a prerequisite for them being useful. Do I need to go back to the thing I just played from Nicole, where she said the real web isn't using browser standards, they're using frameworks that are built on the standards? Anything in the browser that isn't valuable or compatible with frameworks is a bad browser API at this point. And it's sad that web components are a last bastion of that old era of Chrome that are too deep in the weeds to be fixed. But let's see what she has to say. My hypothesis was that the nature of elements being so much more primitive meant that web components that were higher order, like a card component that mounts a button component, an avatar component, and all of these other pieces, that those components would not compose particularly well. Apparently with slots, you can hack in a lot of these things and the composition is functional. I don't like the slot behavior. I like slots to be a property of how component props work. Like if I want a slot in React, I do what I showed before. Like a slot in React is I have a prop that I've defined and I just put it wherever I want to put it. And I love that. And there's also a slot built into React by default. Props.children. You have this default slot built in. And if you want more, you can make more. With web components, you have to use the slot equals and like bind specific named things. But it works. It's cool that it works. But it's not pleasant, especially compared to this level of control. And it feels like slots are an added feature to hack around the fact that properties and attributes can't really be things other than strings, which is obnoxious. And slots are a different way to pass markup because there isn't any other way to do it. What a mess. Anyways, so not all components are the same. There's project-specific components, like a user hover card, a survey question, a color chart, product card, and then generic ones like a tab group, a button group, a pie chart, a star rating, but then things that overlap like HTML demo or color scale. Interesting. I think the crux of this debate is that the community has mixed two very different categories of use cases, largely because frameworks do not differentiate between them. Component has become the hammer with which to hammer every nail. Conceptually, there are two core categories of components. There's generalizable elements that extend what HTML can do and can be used in the same way as native HTML elements across a wide range of diverse projects. Things like tabs, rating widgets, combo boxes, dialogues, menus, charts, etc. Another way to think about these is, if resources were infinite, elements that would make sense as native HTML elements. I think that the way people implement something like a rating widget is unique enough to a project that I wouldn't call that generalizable. But I think the thing I'm going to disagree with here is the idea that these should be separated. Because at what point does your ratings widget go from generic to project specific? At what point does your combo box go from generalizable to very specific to your implementation? The other type of components that Leah's proposing is reactive templating. UI models that have project-specific purposes and are not required to make sense in a different project. For example, a font foundry may have a component to demo a font family with child components to demo a font family style, but the use of such a component outside of the very niche font foundry use case would be very limited. I feel like the line is blurry with so many of these things, and like the relationship between the parts is like, I don't want to have to think about this whenever I'm making a new component. Is this generic enough that it can be a web component, or is it specific enough that I have to make it something else? I hate thinking about these separately. This is frustrating me enough that I'm going to read the Rich thing because I am so curious. We may still need frameworks for non-trivial apps. Web components make their job easier. I feel like Rich, Ryan, and Evan are clearly articulating that instead of making their jobs easier, it's making their jobs harder, and it's effectively a tax. Talking about web components as a building block, same as native elements. They are talking, as I understand them, about using them as a compile target. That's not correct. The tax largely results from the fact that our frameworks need to be able to consume web components. It's a steady source of nasty edge cases, and it causes framework code to be larger and slower. Very true. And again, this is because what Naman said earlier, which is that web components don't follow the existing standards for the DOM. They behave differently from how the DOM behaves, which means the existing code in the frameworks can't just work with web components. It's taken so long for the React team to get web components to behave at all in React. And that's not because they're not putting the effort in, it's because it sucks. And it's also funny that Matt's point is that the criticisms of web components are criticisms of the HTML and the DOM, when web components break our understanding of HTML and DOM. But Rich has a great response here that I'm excited to read. Firstly, I reject the premise that pushing the burden onto users is desirable. If a tax has to be paid, it's better for frameworks to pay it. But beyond that, it's not just about the fact that web components make the platform so much more complex and so much harder to learn. It directly affects users in subtle ways. For example, if you want to clone some DOM to build a component, you can do so with fragment.clone node true, right? Not so fast. If the DOM contains a custom element, the clone won't be assigned to the correct class until it's appended to the document. And if you set properties in the meantime, it won't trigger accessors. They'll shadow the prop type instead, which is very bad news. It's a real head scratcher of a bug. That's fun. These little things, like when you write frameworks, you just assume you can clone nodes to do things, but you can't clone them if they have web components. That sucks. There are fixes though. It turns out that if you use document.import node fragment, true instead, it works correctly. Not that you'll casually learn that while reading MDN. This is the kind of knowledge that is only acquired with a side helping of battle scars. Yeah, this is the problem. The amount of these little things that you have to learn because web components don't follow the browser standard the way that these developers are used to is a very real problem. But there's a catch. Import node is roughly 30% slower than clone node in our testing. That's unacceptable overhead given that most people aren't using custom elements. And if they are, they're certainly not doing it that often. So we opted to pay a different price. The compiler adds a flag to the generated code, and the flag tells the runtime which to use. That's extra code and extra work, albeit a minuscule amount, that would be unnecessary if we didn't have to think about this nonsense. Having the bug, tax. Figuring out the solution, tax. Implementing the fix, tax. Documenting the code for our future selves, tax. Adding regression tests, tax. Running those tests on every CI job, tax. Shipping extra code, tax. Doing more work in a hot code path, tax. And that's just one example. There are others. The bottom line is that framework authors could ship sooner and could ship leaner and more reliable code were it not for this ill-designed primitive with its myriad of edge cases. Leah, you know how much I respect you. You know how much I love the way you've challenged me in the way I think. To you, it's a tax because you're not seeing value. I do not like this reply. I liked this from the bit that I read here. It's always a tax. Having to change how your framework works because the browser added something new is always a tax. Fun call out from Rich earlier. If I could bill someone for the time I've spent working around web components in Svelte, I'd be a rich man. The tax is real. Yeah, it's just one of those things where the cost is really high. And if he saw the value in it, the tax building around it is still real. And a great question from Ryan in chat. Whose onus is it to show the value? Apparently it's ours, which sucks because I haven't seen it. Maybe it's Intercom's onus to show. Yeah, Ryan, you're on vacation. I hope that you're choosing to be here and you don't feel pressured to be here. Thank you for showing up. But like, you missed the rant I went on about how okay I was with you not being here and proud I am that your article is good enough to stand by itself. Like, you can orchestrate an entire drama unintentionally without even being around for it now, which is awesome. Like, your article is so good that the whole thing is just playing itself out now. One more fun call out here from Jenna, who I absolutely adore. She's one of the core contributors to Radix and arguably one of the people most responsible for it existing. So you can thank her for something as awesome as ShadCN. So huge shout out to Jenna, one of my favorite people in the space. Feel this so bad. If Shadow DOM requires this many new specs to make it support stuff that Shadowless DOM can mostly already achieve, when do we acknowledge it was perhaps the wrong abstraction and try again? So much fire. So much fire. Whew. Back to the article. Of course, it's a spectrum. Few things in life fit neatly into completely distinct categories. For example, an HTML demo component might be somewhat niche, but would be useful across any site that wants to demo HTML snippets, like a web component library, a documentation site around web technologies, a book teaching how to implement UI patterns, etc. But the fact that it's a spectrum does not mean the distinction does not exist. There's a lot of distinctions that exist that I don't think necessarily matter. Like, the distinction between gray pants and blue pants is a real distinction, but they're both still pants, and at some point you have to decide if it matters or not. Web components primarily benefit the use case of generalizing elements that extend to HTML and are still painful to use for reactive templating. Fundamentally, it's about the ratio of potential consumers to authors. The huge benefit of web components is interoperability. You write it once, it works forever, and you can use it with any framework or none at all. Here's your tax. When you say that it works with every framework, it doesn't just magically work with every framework. Those frameworks have had to do crazy shit to make it work. And like, I would wager at this point that the amount of effort that framework authors have put into making web components work within them is greater than the also admittedly insane amount of effort that was discussed earlier with the product work on hard mode statement. Yes, making web components and making the standard, insane amount of work. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But you need to stop pretending that it hasn't been as much, if not more work for the authors to do the same thing. And that's what's annoying to me here is everyone had to work really hard for a standard that not very many people were actually asking for. So if you're going to claim interoperability is the big win with web components, y'all should be the ones contributing to Svelte, contributing to React, contributing to these other things. It makes no sense to fragment efforts to re-implement things like tabs or rating widgets separately for each framework-specific silo. It is simply duplicated busy work. It's funny because like I argued against this before knowing this is the point that she was going to make. I said like a ratings widget is absolutely on the line where I'm going to want to do something different with it. This is why something like ShadCN is beating out stuff like component libraries that already exist. With ShadCN, you're cloning code into your code base. So when it comes time to make it more custom, you own the code. With web components, you have to put all this work to make it even work in your framework because of the assumption you might never actually need to modify that web component. With like Builder.io's crazy stuff that they're doing to make it so you can take your React code and port it to every other framework, all of those efforts make the 50 lines of code for a ratings widget being shareable matter a hell of a lot less. Just, it feels like a weird thing to make the framework authors do this much work so a ratings widget could theoretically be shared across projects instead of it being part of the browser standards. I don't see it. The amount of work to port each of these things is low enough, especially now. Fair point from Naman. It's meant to be a common interface. Even if it's flawed, the proponents of things like that at least exist. I can understand why people want a common interface. But if that common interface is bad enough that everyone is repeating their stuff and doing all this crazy work to make it work, at one point, the benefit isn't there. And thank you, Ryan. It's mitosis is the thing that Builder.io made to write your code once and have it work in every framework without web components. Anyways, as a personal anecdote, a few weeks ago, I found an amazing JSON viewer component, but I couldn't use it because I don't use React. I prefer Vue and Svelte. To this day, I've not found anything comparable for Vue, Svelte, or Vanilla.js. This kind of fragmentation is sadly an everyday occurrence for most devs. Let me take a look at this. I'm assuming it's on GitHub. Because I would bet writing this in something like web components would be fucking miserable. Like, I bet this is a lot of code for this. Look at all of the code for this. Has anybody made a web component this big that's open source and not absolutely fucking miserable to work in? Once you get to this level of dynamic, it feels really hard to make that a web component. Like, if anyone has an example of something this complex that's open source in a web component, I would genuinely like to read through it and look at the code, but it's hard for me to imagine. Model viewer from Google. So the only example is something Google made. And it's still using packages. And it's using lit. It's still using a framework. Like, you can't build something this large without a framework of some form. It's cool that it's a web component, so it's reusable, but you still need a framework anyways. Like, ugh. As for the JSON viewer thing, it is much harder to write things that complex with web components. And even if you do, you're going to need to pull in something like lit. And lit had to be built to make web components like usable. And my counter here is like, on one hand, it does suck that this amazing JSON viewer can't be used in things that aren't React. I mean, you can mount a small React thing inside of a viewer's Svelte app. It's just not fun. But on the other hand, I don't think it's fair to push that developers like them have to learn this other new thing that is significantly more complex with all of these foot guns for the potential of people using it in these other things, especially if it means the interop of working inside of React viewer's Svelte is worse. If React's being used by 70% of their potential users, and writing in a React makes it easier to bind, pass children to, and do all these other things, it is really hard to justify rewriting that or writing something like it in web components instead. Especially if we get to the point where generating and rewriting this code for viewer Svelte gets easier due to all the new tools and AI and shit that's happening. Anyways, when it comes to project-specific components, the importance of interop decreases. You typically pick a framework and stick to it across your entire project. Reusing project-specific components across different projects is not a major need, so the value prop of interop is smaller. Additionally, the ergonomics of consuming versus authoring web components are vastly different. Consuming web components is already pretty smooth. The APIs are largely there to demystify most of the magic of built-in elements and expose it to web components, with a few small gaps being actively plugged as we speak. That I don't agree with, because consuming them in other frameworks, which is how, as Nicole established earlier, how most websites are being built. If you're writing vanilla HTML, mounting and consuming a web component is great. But the ability to take a web component and mount it in your React app and pass it properties and have everything work properly, that's still not smooth sailing. It's far from smooth sailing right now. So to say that consuming them is pretty smooth when the way the majority of the web is built makes them quite hard to consume feels very unfair. Regardless of that, even Leah agrees that authoring web components is miserable. Especially without a library like Lit, authoring web components is still painful, tedious, and riddled with footguns. For generalizable elements, this is an acceptable trade-off, as their potential consumers are a much larger group than the authors. As an extreme example of this, nobody complains about the ergonomics of implementing native elements in browsers using C++ or Rust. But when using components as a templating mechanism, authoring ergonomics are crucial, since the overlap between consumers and authors is nearly 100%. Apparently, she did a Twitter poll a while back. I would love to take a look at that. Oh, look, she did the same poll I did earlier. I mostly use web components. I both make and use web components, and I don't use web components at all. What's interesting here is people who are using web components are also making them, which is what I'm guessing she thought wasn't the case. Apparently, most people who are using them also make them, which is really interesting. Also account for the bias of people following Leah and doing her poll, especially with only 430 votes. That is a deep subset of JavaScript devs. Know that many people who use web components are not aware of it, so the motivation was not to gauge adoption, but to see if the community has caught on to the distinction between the use cases. The fact that over 80% of people who knowingly use web components are also web component authors is indicative of the problem. Web components are meant to empower folks to do more, not to be consumed by expert web developers who can also write them. Until the number becomes a lot smaller, web components will not have reached their full potential. That's one of the reasons that I joined the Web Awesome project. I think that it's the right direction for web components, encapsulating complexity into beautiful, generalizable, customizable elements that give people superpowers by extending what HTML can do. They can be used by developers to author gorgeous UIs, designers to do more without having to learn JS, or even hobbyists that struggle with both. So what's funny, I brought this up earlier. ShadCN is a similar goal to make these reusable base pieces that are insanely useful for web developers. You have a custom form element that makes dealing with your forms easier. You have a hover card that has this fancy card that comes up when you hover things. You have a label that works. You have much more complex things too, like radio groups, which are obnoxious to do right, or select, which came up earlier because the select component kind of sucks, or toasts and Sonner and all of these different things for managing how toasts appear on your page. All of these could be web components. And we had an in-between. There's almost, God, I can't believe I'm Excalibur drawing this late into a video. There's a spectrum here, where on one side we have elements I wrote in my code base. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have base HTML elements. So on one side of the spectrum, we have like div and button. And on the other side, we have the shit that I'm writing for my code base, like the components. I'll say components here to be more clear. And I guess my big issue with this article is it's being described as though these are two different things, but these are just 2 points on the spectrum. General components are more on that side, and reusable components that are being built in my framework are closer to here. I guess that's the project-specific ones. But within the spectrum, there's a lot of different stop points. Like here, I would say we have web components. They're as customizable as they're exposed to be, but you can't really change the fundamentals of how they work. You can't change the logic of a web component when you're consuming it unless you fork it and make changes to it. Something else I'd say is similar would be like a material UI and other UI libraries. These two are pretty close to the base HTML element thing. What we have learned as an ecosystem is if you're not this, being close to it kind of sucks. And that's why we moved the other way, where we have stuff like ShadCN. And ShadCN looks and operates similarly to Material UI, where you have all the components you can grab and use, but it's in your code base, so you can change it however you want, so you're not compromising on the ownership. The argument for web components is you shouldn't want to own it. It is basically an extension of HTML elements on the browser. But as soon as it's customizable enough, as soon as it's valuable enough, as soon as it's complex enough, you end up needing to customize it at some point. And I think within the spectrum, the place that web components live is a place that not many developers spend a whole lot of time. And we see that because we are very quickly moving off of stuff like Material UI in favor of stuff like ShadCN. The whole industry is trending to the right here. Web components are saying that we should have better solutions on the left. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm saying you should not expect people who are living over here to put a bunch of time and effort into making this thing that we've already decided isn't that valuable better. That's it. And since with ShadCN, you actually, as I mentioned like 5 times now, you clone the code into your code base, you get the full ownership and customizability. So you get the ergonomic benefits of having good reusable pieces and not compromising on the ownership. The one catch is it's only for React. Does that kind of suck? Sure. But if it wasn't just for React, it'd have to be written in a way that the ownership model doesn't work for. Because if I'm a React dev and I'm using ShadCN and it's web components and I need to change something about it, and I don't know the craziness that is web component syntax, as you've established, Leah, web components suck to write, then it being in my code base no longer matters. It has foregone all of the potential benefits. And could you theoretically add an infinite number of attributes and properties and flags and booleans to the things on the left here so you don't need to customize them? Perhaps. But you will eventually get to the point where you need more customization or something is missing in those pieces. And owning it solves that problem. Also of note, there's effort to rewrite ShadCN in other frameworks. I know that there's a really far along ShadCN Svelte project that is rewriting all of the components for Svelte. It's happening. And the reason people are putting the effort into this is we agree this is the right solution. Solid has an equivalent too. They look nearly identical. Again, the point is we agree this is the right solution. Back to Leah's article quick. Making it about frameworks versus web components is a false dichotomy. Frameworks already use the native HTML elements in their components. Web components extend what native elements can do and thus make crafting project-specific components easier across all frameworks. As Rich established, this assumes the framework authors have learned all the ways that web components don't follow the rules of what native elements do and have built solutions to all of those, which makes this a much more painful paragraph to read, knowing that it is missing that core point. Also, we may still need frameworks for non-trivial apps, but web components make their job easier. I would once again cite Nicole's statement earlier, where it has been established by the Chrome team that all real teams and projects are using frameworks now. And I don't think we are the ones doing the pitting. I really haven't seen examples from like Rich Harris or Ryan Carniato or any of these anti-web component people saying, why would we do that? React components are better. We have had a discussion about how hard it is to use web components and how it doesn't seem like they're solving a real problem. But that is different from saying React is good, web components bad. I think I'm probably the closest thing to that. And my diagram I just drew is probably the closest thing. We will certainly eventually get to the point where web components are more ergonomic to author, but first we need to get the low-level foundations right. At this point, the focus is still on making things possible rather than making them easy. The last remaining piece of the puzzle are things like reference targets for cross-root areas or elementinternals.type to allow custom elements to become popover targets or submit buttons. Wait, are you telling me that right now you can't have a web component button that is a submit button? Please tell me that's not true. Not true? Okay. Just making sure. Thank you, chat, for clarifying. Okay, Naman says he's unsure, which makes me much more skeptical now. You know what? Tiebreaker. God, I promised you guys I wouldn't make you look at web component syntax. I'm so sorry. If this dot has attribute form ID is get attribute form, button, shadow root query selector button, set attribute form ID. So you have to manually set the form ID and manually render this type submit on it. So apparently, according to Damon, there's been pushback to allow for custom elements to be like form elements specifically, form associated for that purpose. Let's ask Claude about it. So I hope you guys can understand that, yes, I don't know all of the different things you can do in web components, but the whole point is that they're a browser standard. Why are there 15 APIs for fucking everything with them? And here's the form associated button code. Form associated is true. Attach shadow root, put the styles in. Button part equals button. slot button. Where is the submit bound though? Is it not? Oh, it's so, I mean, it's a web component. It requires JS anyways, but you're not using type as submit anymore. Now you're this._internals.form.request submit. I can't take it in good faith. I'm sorry. I'm trying. But you know how I do this in React? Function, demo form, return form, input, type equals text, form, save so it formats. Say I want to let's say I just want a normal button for submit. Type equals submit. And if I want that to be a custom component in React, if I have a custom button, function custom button, turn, cut, paste, done. And if I want this to be a custom button that isn't always type submit, I can do that too. Props, type string. I could be more specific with the type if I wanted to. Type equals props.type. Type equals submit. Look at that. That's going to be, say it has to be one of these. Cool. Since this is TypeScript, and TypeScript is smart, yoink. Well, let's do that. Cool. Now I can pass any of the button element types. And it's that easy. There we go. Perhaps eventually web components will even become viable for reactive templating use cases, like the open stylable shadow roots proposal, declarative elements, or DOM parts. All of these are some of the early beginnings of that direction, and declarative shadow DOM paving the way for SSR, among other things. Then, and only then, they may make sense as a compile target for frameworks. But as Rich established, it's not just the compile target, it's interoperability inside of a framework. Components are not even the best reuse mechanism for every project-specific use case. For list rendering, components are overkill compared to something like v-4, and by then, frameworks will be doing even more. It is by definition that frameworks are always a step ahead of the web platform, not a failing of the web platform. As Corey said, frameworks are a testbed for new ideas that may or may not work out. They are also how the web is built. And I feel like Leah has a fundamental disagreement with the research and effort that Nicole put in, which really hurts to know. Bottom line is, web components reduce the number of use cases where we need to reach for a framework, but complex, large applications will likely still benefit from one. So how about we conclude that frameworks are useful, web components are also useful, stop fighting, and go make awesome shit using whatever tool we find most productive. Once this article ends with, we are sorry that this has made authoring frameworks much harder and that the interop story has felt more like gaslighting and a lie, then I would be much happier with this article. But I feel like it fundamentally ignored the pain that these framework authors have gone through. It tried to acknowledge how they felt gaslit, but it missed almost everything else here. And that's sad. I can't talk about this stuff anymore. Peace, nerds.